Welcome. My name is Jerry Bowers. I am the Director of Development and Public Affairs at the MDI Biological Laboratory. I also am a board member of Frenchman Bay United, which is a new nonprofit organization recently formed to help protect the health of Frenchman Bay and has been actively involved in opposing a major salmon aquaculture farm that is in process here in our bay. So we're very proud, the MDI Biological Lab is very proud to be partnering with Frenchman Bay United this evening in bringing this special science cafe to our audience. So we have a great group that have registered tonight. We had over 300 participants register. So lots of interest in this topic, and we're very, very pleased and honored to have Alexandra Morton with us this evening. But before I introduce her, I want to just go over a couple of quick housekeeping details just so that we can have an efficient session this afternoon. I know that many of you are very, very familiar. Zoom has become our second world these days. But because we do have so many folks on this evening, we are going to try to use the raise hand feature. So Alex is going to just talk. She doesn't have a PowerPoint presentation. She really wants to engage in a Q&A, but we're going to let her make some introductory remarks, kind of give us an overview, and then we're going to open it up to question and answer. So if you have that reaction icon in your bar, whether it's at the lower part of your screen or perhaps if you're on a mobile device, it's in the upper corner, there is a raise hand feature there, and that will help us kind of keep track of folks who has questions in what order, and we'll call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask your question. We do ask, however, if you're not asking a question, that you remain muted just to try and minimize background noise and interruption. And then for those of you who don't want to verbally ask a question, you are more than welcome to type your question in the chat. We'll be monitoring those questions. We'll convey those to Alex and make sure that everyone's questions are answered. So with that, I just, again, want to welcome everyone. I know we have a number of first-time Science Cafe attendees, or at least MDI Biological Lab Science Cafe attendees. So I want to just extend a special welcome to all of you. For those who may not be familiar, the Science Cafe is actually an international movement. So these happen all around the world. They're really intended to be very casual conversations about topics that relate to scientific issues, relate to sort of critical issues in community. And it's really a way for us to engage the community in a dialogue about science. And so MDIBL has been running these science cafes since 2011, and they have become a really essential part of our community outreach and engagement. So thank you all for being here this evening. For those that may not know, the MDI Biolab is a 123-year-old research institution. We have a very long history of environmental research. We have a lot of scientists who are fish biologists and who have that in their background. So this is an issue that we are very committed to, very interested in, and certainly have a long track record of protecting the health of Frenchman Bay. So with that, I am thrilled to welcome Alexandra Morton to our Science Cafe stage this evening to talk about her decades-long fight to ban Atlantic salmon aquaculture in British Columbia, or salmon aquaculture in British Columbia. And I'm really excited to bring her here. I had the opportunity, as I know many of you did, to read her book and really was just so struck with the similarities between her experiences and what we are seeing here in Maine, and particularly in Frenchman Bay. As those of you who are here this evening are aware, this is what is being proposed here in our bay is one of the largest ocean-based salmon farms in North America, and it would be located right here in the midst of Acadia National Park. So there's a lot at stake, and we really want to make sure that we understand the issues and that we are doing all we can to protect the health and traditional accesses to the bay. So with that, Alex is going to share a bit with us about her story, and in particular how a whale biologist really came to lead this decades-long fight against salmon aquaculture. And unfortunately, I think you'll hear the sort of recurring theme in her story is this continued resistance from regulatory agencies to really honor the science and to make choices that place environmental protection over profit. And so that's what we want to try to do our best to prevent here in this bay, to not let that happen. So with that, Alex, thank you so much for being here. Welcome. We're really looking forward to hearing all that you have to say and just to engage with you in a conversation about this application.
Hi, really nice to get a chance to talk to all of you. I understand there's people not only from Maine, but also Canada and maybe even Tasmania, where they are also dealing with this industry. I just want to say, you know, my heart goes out to every community that's dealing with this, because it's so hard to know how strongly to react when it first comes, because salmon farming, it sounds so great. It sounds nice. It sounds like, yeah, it's a good idea. Make your fish in a pen so you let the wild fish exist, and yet people can eat salmon. And that's what I thought. When salmon farming first came to British Columbia, I was living in a really remote community called Echo Bay, with like no roads, no power. We got our mail by seaplane 3 times a week. And I had moved there to study killer whales. And when the salmon farming industry arrived, the government said it was going to be good for my community. And I had no reason to think that wasn't true. We had a little 1-room school and we were always short of kids. So, I thought, okay, it's going to, bring more families. And I didn't really notice anything about it until the fishermen came to me. And I talked to a lot of fishermen because they are salmon predators that speak English, and I can generally understand them, whereas the killer whales were, a lot harder to understand, and they helped me learn a lot of things. But they came to me and they said, hey, they're putting the salmon farms in all the wrong places. And that's when I first got alerted to the problem, because the industry knew what it was doing. And they picked the places with the cool water, the oxygen, the flow, not too much flow, not too little. But these were places that already had wild fish. They had particularly the salmon, rock cod, and prawns and shrimp. And so it was those fishermen who were coming to me. And so I thought, okay, great, I'll write a letter. And so I wrote a letter to Fisheries and Oceans Canada, outlining everything they said. And the answer I got back was, dear Ms. Morton, there's no evidence. Okay, I thought, well, fair enough. I didn't really say very much there. And so I dove in a little bit more. And in the end, I ended up writing 10,000 pages of letters. And this was as more and more evidence appeared. And I was now seeing it for myself, like toxic algae blooms, an algae called heterosigma, which had never been found in my area, was suddenly turning the water red, and people's lips were going numb. And we had Atlantic salmon in our Pacific rivers. And there was other just, gunfire and ropes and things like that. And the government never took any of these things seriously. Then we began to have disease outbreaks in our little hatchery. And because the fish farmers at first lived in our community, and we got together and, we had dinner together, and after a couple beers, they were talking about, how they had these outbreaks of disease in the farms. And those of us working at the hatchery were like, oh my gosh, we have the same disease and we've never seen it before. And so then I began to really dig around, read the literature, get to know people in Norway that were dealing with this industry. And at some point realized, okay, the government is just not here. There's no government scientists here. So every time they tell me there is no evidence, they just, I figured, well, okay, they're waiting for me to get the evidence because they're not. So then I began to do the science. And the first science I did was on the displacement of the killer whales. They began to use really loud noises to keep the seals away. And it was the whales that went, not the seals. And then I collected over 700 Atlantic salmon in a gillnet fishery, and I wrote about that. And then the sea lice outbreaks became clear. And I phoned Fisheries and Oceans Canada and I said, hey, we have a serious sea lice outbreak. The juvenile salmon, which for us, 2 of the species come out and they're just tiny like that, the pink and the chum salmon. And they were covered with lice and they were just floundering around on the surface. It was really easy to see that there was a major problem. And I had read about this happening in Norway and Scotland and Ireland. And so I contacted Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and they said, "Oh, could you get us some samples?" So I was like, "Okay, yes, finally, they want evidence." So I went out in my boat and I got them some samples and I sent them down there in a cooler at my expense. And they sent an officer, an armed officer, to my door to charge me with poaching. And that's when I began to really realize that the government was not going to fix this. And so watching that number of salmon getting infected, like some years it was up to 98% of the fish had more lice than the research from Norway suggested that they could survive. And I began to attract other scientists in my home because it's very hard to go out into a remote area and do research. You know, you need a place to stay. So I was feeding all these young scientists, and more of them came. They began publishing in the top journals in the world. I engaged in every single government process that was offered beginning in 1995. I went to Norway to the AGMs of the companies because we only had Norwegian companies. Um, and was actually spoke at one of them at the Maui AGM, and they actually laughed at me. They're like, "No, we're not leaving." Well, it turns out they are, but um, you know, I I took them to court 5 times through an environmental law firm called EcoJustice, and others I had to raise money for. I never lost, but nothing changed. Um, and so for me as a biologist, watching extinction in play, the way I studied the sea lice is at 150-foot net in my speedboat. And I jump out and tie it to the shore and then do a big arc with the boat and then jump out again and pull the net all the way in until there's just this small little bit of them. And then I dip a 5-gallon bucket in there. And then every single, or 50, I counted out 50. Every single one of them, I picked them up with a little aquarium net, put them in a little baggie with a little bit of water. And then I had looked at them with a hand lens and counted not only the number of sea lice, but how old the sea lice were. And because sea lice change their body shape every few days for the first 30 days, it was very easy to tell where the lice were getting on. They were getting on when the fish got near the farms. But what this meant was I was going eye to eye with these little fish. And it just destroyed me every single spring to watch so much suffering, so much unnecessary death, particularly for a species, you know, salmon, which are such a generous species. They feed everything around them. In British Columbia, research has shown they feed over 100 species, from insects to orcas. They feed trees, the trees that are pulling the carbon out of the atmosphere, which we so desperately need them to do. And so it was an emotional thing for me as well as a scientific thing. But I channeled all of that into being as absolutely constructive as possible. And that was, you know, publishing science, which is, it's not easy. I'm not with a university. I'm not with a big organization. But I teamed up with people, and we predicted extinction of the Broughton Archipelago pink salmon in 2007. And we're just about there. We have entire rivers with no salmon left in them at all. And, you know, when I first found the sea lice problem, I wrote to these researchers in Norway, and one of them answered me. And the first thing he said was, "Do you have fish farms there?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "My suggestion to you is that you drop this, because your government isn't going to like you doing this work, and the companies are not going to like you doing this work." And that was that was a pretty bold thing for a scientist to say to an unknown scientist in another country. But he was right. The Scottish scientist was hilarious. He's like, "Okay, can't you guys in Canada read? Don't you know that you were going to have this problem? Everywhere this industry goes, sea lice, which are completely natural, get into these farms, which are a feedlot, and then they multiply unnaturally. It's just like we've all been dealing with COVID. We know that big gatherings with somebody with an infection causes big infections. Well, this is exactly the problem with the salmon farms. And then we had a big commission here, and I got access to the disease records of the salmon farms and discovered that there were viruses of, or there was evidence of viruses of extraordinary concern, like infectious salmon anemia virus and others. And so then I became a virus hunter. I began fanning out across the coast. I hired people to go further than I could. I found a lab to work with, and we found evidence of every single virus that was noted in these disease records. And I published on those, and government just said, oh yeah, no, those are local, those are fine. Or for infectious salmon anemia virus, no, you didn't find that. And I wrote about the whole thing in my book here because I wanted to, there had to be a record of what went on, because for a long time, it was like I was living in an alternative reality. I began to sound unhinged because everything seemed wrong. They couldn't control their sea lice no matter what they said. They could not control their viruses no matter what they said. The fish were dying. Everything I said was happening. And then in just after 2010, I decided, okay, none of this is working. So what about activism? And so I got together with some friends, and we came up with the idea of walking the whole length of Vancouver Island. We called it the Get Out Migration. And we were saying, get fish farms out of the ocean. And at the end of the walk, we had 5,000 to 7,000 people at the Parliament buildings in Victoria, and it did nothing. And then later that year, 100 of us got into canoes, and we canoed for 10 days. And then we took over an entire street of Vancouver, and we walked into this huge commission on the collapse of the Fraser River sockeye, which is the biggest salmon run in the world. Didn't work. Nothing happened. And then in 2016, Paul Watson of the environmental organization Sea Shepherd put up a Facebook message, and he said, I'm sending a boat to help Alexandra Morton with the salmon farming issue. Well, I was a bit shocked, and I messaged him back, could you please take that down? Because I wasn't ready to go that step. Sea Shepherd has a reputation of being very confrontational, and that was not my intention. I was just trying, I'm still trying as much as possible to have somebody look at the science of this, and not only my science by now, but all these other brilliant young scientists who were working on it. Well, Paul Watson didn't take it down, and in the end, he did send a boat, and I took the boat into our First Nation communities. And one thing led to the next. And in the winter of 2017, we occupied the salmon farms for 280 days. We got on the farms, people built houses on them, put solar panels on them, put satellite dishes on the little houses. It was grueling. It was tense. It was cold. It was frightening. But what happened next was that the chiefs of these regions, the occupation was largely Indigenous and largely young First Nation women. The chiefs were like, okay. They knew this was a problem, and they said, okay, we have to deal with it. And they went into talks with the government, and the talks went on for a year. When they came out the other end, a couple of salmon farms were going to disappear every single year in this one place, the Broughton Archipelago, where I was living and this occupation had happened and the research had occurred. And so we are now in a position of studying what happens when you take the farms out. And the first thing that happens is the sea lice drop incredibly. Then this spread to another group of First Nations, and now another 19 salmon farms are going. So here in British Columbia, 38 salmon farms of the approximate 100 either are gone or have an expiration date. And that's because the impact of this industry is so enormous. Now, I'm not against aquaculture. I think that there may be a strong future for it in providing food. But what they would need to do is grow algae and then grow a fish that eats the algae and then take the waste of the fish and grow some kind of plant crop and create this artificial enclosed ecosystem. And don't let it spill out into the wild, because salmon farms, whether it's viruses, bacteria, or parasites, they're going to always amplify them. There's always going to be a problem. And they cannot fix that, because the reason they're in the ocean is so that they have ocean water coming through. Now, the organizers of this event provided an amazing document that really put together what you guys are facing in Maine and what the companies are saying, or the company. I mean, I'm glad we don't have cook aquaculture here, to be honest, because they don't have a good reputation. They're next door down in Washington State, where they've also been told now that they can't grow Atlantic salmon anymore. But that closed containment, semi-closed containment facility that they're advertising there, it's not working here. And that's not cook aquaculture, that's right. They're not doing the closed containment, but the American aquaculture company from Norway is talking about the semi-closed containment. Well, they tried it, Cermaq, a Norwegian company, tried it here, and they had to terminate the experiment before the fish had finished growing out because it didn't work. There was a huge die-off. It's pretty hushed up about actually what happened. We don't know, but they terminated it. They're in deep trouble in British Columbia, and they will do anything to try to stay, and yet they terminated the very equipment that they're planning to use in your waters. So the other thing that just really struck me in reading this document is the lack of intention and oversight by your government. I don't know how this keeps happening. There's another book that was written and published this year, and it's this book. It's about salmon farming in Tasmania, and they say the same thing. Somehow the government will not look into this problem. I'm not at all sure why that's the case. But when I read about how the government in Maine is handling this, I thought, oh my gosh, it's exactly the same. Evidence is being provided to them. Evidence exists around the world, and yet governments refuse to look at it. For scientists like myself, it has been a very difficult road. The industry is brutal to scientists, whether you're in Norway or Canada or Scotland. There is one case after the next of just slander. There are investigations into non-professional behavior. There was a scientist in Norway that discovered that infectious salmon anemia had been moved by a company in Norway to Chile, where it caused $2 billion worth of damage to the Chilean industry. And he published a paper on this. And the salmon farming industry and the Norwegian government did investigations into his conduct in publishing this paper. Now, he was able to clear his name, but it didn't help. Once you're tarnished that way as a scientist, it's very, very hard to get past that. And so the industry, they behave like bullies. And the sad thing is, if in British Columbia, the industry said, okay, look, we don't really think we're having an impact, but we hear you. And we're going to solve it this way, then I would never have escalated to the position I'm in now. I'd still be happily studying killer whales. But they never said that. They always said I was wrong, I was misguided. Now they say I have different motives. They say I'm highly paid, on and on, like just noise. But they don't address the fact that they are amplifying disease. If they had done that, British Columbia would probably have a leading, closed, recirculating, land-based industry with nothing getting out. That's where this has to go. But instead, they're being run out of town. However, the really, really sad thing is, We're running them out of the Broughton, but there's entire rivers here now with no fish at all. And rivers that had 50,000 that have 28. And, you know, this is really, it's really sad. It's because it's very hard to put salmon back. So when I see a community like yours, who's trying to go about this in a fair and rational manner, all I can say is just take your bodies and stand in the way and don't let it happen. And the industry will change. It will do something different. But if you let it happen, it quickly gets bigger, and then there's suppliers, and then there's people employed, and it just goes on and on and on and on. It just gets bigger and bigger. Now we are in a very painful process, and thank goodness the current federal government in Canada has decided to get rid of this industry in British Columbia, not the East Coast for some reason, but in British Columbia. But there's sparks flying all over the place. There's people losing their jobs, which of course does not feel good or right. And so that's why you just want to stop it while it's small. It has not worked anywheres in the world. I have looked because I kept thinking, okay, if there was one place in the world where this had worked, let's have a really good look at that and let's do what they did. But the other thing is, this industry is not making food. Salmon eat fish. So before you go to farm salmon, you got to go fishing, and you got to go fishing hard. So they're fishing, you have huge fisheries in the South Pacific and the North Atlantic. And oh yeah, they are adding a lot of grain products, but there's only so much grain products that these fish can take before they start to have trouble digesting it and you know, get sick. And so as the industry grows and grows and grows, their consumption of wild fish is not going down. So it's not sustainable. They're not feeding the world. If you wanted to feed the world, you'd eat that first fish. So there's, I have begun to see them as the emperor with no clothes. They're not sustainable. They have a huge carbon footprint. They're fishing hard. They're not feeding the world because they're using more fish than they make. They're not benign in any way. And you have the lobster fishery, which, you know, we're not facing that here, but I visited New Brunswick and Nova Scotia a few years ago and talked to lobster fishermen, and they were in tears because the lobster is so sensitive and they're so valuable. And this thing just came in and just, you know, literally started to poop all over them. You know, it was hard to understand how Canada had allowed that to happen to this lobster fishery, particularly when there's another option. So
can I just jump in real quick and ask about that? I mean, is there documented evidence or published research of the impact on the lobster fishery?
there is a woman, Inka Mileski in Nova Scotia, who has done some work on that, and she's like me for Eastern Canada. She doesn't do activism, but she's done the science, and I would really suggest reaching out to her.
Right. Because, you know, like your Pacific salmon, I mean, lobster are clearly our cherished species here, you know, for a number of reasons. But so it's, you know, that's not an area that we have really done. I think, you know, we have more work to do to really document the potential impact on the lobster fishery.
The other thing the lobster fishermen said and were really upset about was the drugs that they were using to try to kill the lice. Sea lice are actually a crustacean, and so are lobster. And the guys said that the big whaleboats would come and then they'd pull their traps and the lobsters were all curled up. And they said you could kind of open them, but they just snap right back together like that. And then the next day they didn't get lobster, and they never got lobster there again. So there was a lot of concern, not only about the waste and the changes to the seafloor, but also to the chemicals. Right now in British Columbia, they have brought over 300-foot boats, 2 of them from Norway, that suck the farm fish in and bathe them in a hydrogen peroxide bath and then pour that out. And I did a plankton tow right behind them, I'm doing a lot of research around these boats right now, but around the hydrogen peroxide, did a plankton tow. And normally when you do a plankton tow and you put them in the jar, the little zooplankton or all their little swimmerettes are going and their eyes are moving. And I mean, it's incredible to watch them. Nothing was moving.
Mm.
I mean, that was a small sample size, but it is her hydrogen peroxide.
Wow.
And there's researchers in Norway that have worked on that too, but that research has been suppressed. They never did get it to publish. It was a PhD project. So I'd love to answer any questions you have. If you feel like you think the industry is going to work, let me know that and let me speak to it, because aquaculture is not the problem, but open net pen salmon farms, it's never going to work. It hasn't worked anywhere.
So we do have a couple of questions here in the chat, and one is related to the source of, sorry, my chat's moving so quickly here, the origin of the wild fish used. And I assume she's talking about in the food, in the feed for the salmon. It says there's an attempt at justification that trash fish or fish parts are used. In Tasmania, we can seem to find the origin of the fish meal.
So a lot of, they cover their tracks in a lot of things, but the problem with trash fish is that what they really want is the oil. They want oily fish. And that's like your anchovies and your sardines, and they're not trash fish. Mm-hmm. So they may be grinding up offal and things like that, but they are going after that oil because they want the omega oils in their product. When you go to buy farm salmon, or you go to a sushi restaurant and you get farm salmon, the orange has these white stripes in it. This photograph here really shows that. Wild salmon doesn't actually look like that very often. That white is fat, and that's a big part of their product. So they want that. They want those oily fish. Those very valuable, disappearing oily fish.
Yeah, fascinating. All right, so let's see here. I'm just trying to sort through the chat. Have there been any studies documenting what happens to the wild salmon population when farmed salmon escape from pens during storms?
So this has not been a big, I mean, it is a problem here in British Columbia, but it's a bigger problem in Norway because the Atlantics and the Pacific don't appear to breed together. But in Norway, they consider genetic pollution their biggest problem with the salmon farms. And what they discovered is that the farm salmon hybrids, so farm salmon gets into the river, they're big, they're aggressive, they outcompete the wild males, they mate with the females, and their kids are big and aggressive and very hungry. And so they'll outcompete the juveniles of the wild fish, but then their homing instinct is damaged and they're not making it back. So when I went to Norway and met with other scientists, there was this group of scientists who had built a weir to catch all the fish going into the Vaso River. And the Vaso is a river the Norwegians are extremely proud of. It was the biggest Atlantics in the world. And they tag and hold every single fish to figure out if it's a truly wild fish or if it's a hybrid or just a farm fish. And if it's a hybrid or farm fish, they kill it and they just let the wild ones go up, which obviously is an enormous amount of effort. So yeah, they're not good for the wild genetics at all. They've been bred, they've been domesticated, be like breeding a domestic chicken with a bird that has to migrate thousands of miles. It's not a good idea.
Okay, we have one raised hand. So Feely M, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Turn your camera on if you'd like.
I would like to ask a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Alexandra, in your book, which I've started to read and I love it, you're a great writer. You talk about Rockefeller, who owns, and excuse me if I don't remember the acronym, IBEC for Norway Fish Farm. Is that the same Rockefeller that is involved in Acadia National Park?
I don't know. So the company was IBEC, and that was the first fish farmer to come into the Broughton in the late 80s, early 90s. And as I understand it, they also raised pigs in the United States. So I'm not really sure, but all those fish started to die, and they sold out to the Norwegians, who brought the Atlantics, and the Atlantics survived much better.
Okay,
Interesting.
thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So a couple of other questions here. Folks are emailing and putting in the chat. Alex, do you have a view of whether the process is financially corrupt, or simply is it inadvertent complicity in terms of government and relationships with these corporate entities?
Oh, that's really getting to the heart of it. I think it's corrupt because, well, this one conversation I had in specifically with government about 20 years ago now, I brought him a map to the minister in charge. And I said to him, look, I really feel, given everything we know about this industry from Norway, that you should leave at least one migration route for the wild salmon in this area open. And he said he had. And I showed him the map, and there was clearly farms on every single migration route. Matter of fact, there were several. Like for salmon to get out of the Broughton, it would have to climb out of the ocean over land and carry on. Obviously, it can't do that. And the minister kept saying to me, that was my opinion. I'd say, no, it's not my opinion. We got to look at the map. So he was cornered, and in front of that evidence, he couldn't see the evidence. And in my work, I do a lot of things. I do the science, I'm out there in the field, I've done activism, I've gone to court, but I also access the internal communications between DFO staff and the fish farm industry and others through our Access to Information Act. And I can see places where some scientists in DFO clearly understand there's a problem, and they will say one thing and their comments will be edited out, and they'll say it again and they'll be edited out. And then when they go public, they're muzzled. They're not allowed to, speak in public. They're not allowed to be seen with me. It's like, it's ridiculous. As if I'm going to influence another scientist to become corrupt and change their entire career based on what I said. It's ludicrous. So there is corruption somewhere in all of this. And I think at this point in British Columbia, the corruption may have happened a while ago. And now people just don't really even understand why they're doing what they're doing. They're just invested in it. But the First Nations and lawyers are going after them hard. And honestly, if I was running one of these companies in British Columbia, I would freaking get up and run, because viruses have fingerprints and we're tracking them. You can tell how long a virus has been separated from its original population, whether that's in a hatchery or it's in Norway. And we can see what it's doing to the wild fish, because the virus science on fish is moving ahead in leaps and bounds. There's incredible research being done, pioneered here in British Columbia, and salmon farming industry and government are trying to suppress it. But somehow these scientists are not quitting, and they are a huge asset. So I forget where this, oh yeah, it has to be some level of dishonesty, of unwillingness to see what is going on. And the other thing that here in British Columbia is I honestly don't think the government wanted wild salmon, because the problem with them is it makes Canada negotiate with the United States. It makes government say no to oil and logging and mining and urban development and all kinds of things that people want to say yes to.
Interesting. All right, we have a couple of other questions here. One is a follow-up from the Tasmania folks. Says we also have huge wellboats in Tasmania. They use large counts of a disinfectant called Vicron. I'm not sure I have the name correct. What impacts might this have? Have you heard? Are you familiar with that at all?
Virkon?
Yeah, maybe it's Vikron is how it's spelled here.
I believe the only use for that here in British Columbia is to dip people's boots in when you get on the farm. So I don't know what they're doing with that in a wellboat, but this is the trouble when you use chemicals to kill lice or to kill parasites of any kind. Well, they kill things. And so when you release that into the ocean, they're not going to stop killing.
Right.
The ocean just can't take this right now. We know this. We have to allow it to rebalance itself. So yeah, those big wellboats are just deadly in my view.
Hmm. Okay, so I have one other question here. It says, do you have a view on who's doing the best job in opposing the salmon farms in terms of countries or states? Do you have tactical advice on the most effective strategies and potential partners?
We in British Columbia are doing the best job. But coming up quickly behind is Scotland. And so one of the reasons I wrote my book is because I just was like decade after decade banging my head against the wall, trying to open a door that didn't even have hinges. It was really soul destroying. And then here comes this big sailboat, the Martin Sheen, which Sea Shepherd lent to us. And then stuff just started to happen. And so I had to try to put that together. Why did everything just sit there stagnant and then suddenly go off? And number one was a hereditary chief, George Kwok's sister, who got on the boat. He came with us and he decided to get on every single salmon farm and stick a camera down on a long pole. And he did this dressed in his regalia. So the fish farmers just didn't know what to do about him. They didn't want to throw him bodily off the farm. And so he caught these horrendous images. And so then I edited those together and we took them into the various First Nation villages, the First Nations who were hosting this industry. And I remember one community was in tears. They just were like, shut it off. We don't even want to watch. This has to go. And there's a guy two guys, Don Staniford and another guy called Corbin in Scotland, who are doing this as well. They're going up to the farm and they're just sticking cameras down. And I got to say, it's even worse in Scotland, what they're showing. And now the salmon farming industry has stuck a tracker on the bottom of the car of one of these guys, which is very similar to what happened to me, where they hired a group called Black Cube to follow me around in these boats with blacked out windows. It was ridiculous. So the strategy that is working is to let people know as much as you can what is going on inside those farms, whether it's with drones or it's with cameras. I don't want to be, promoting illegal activity. And so everybody needs to make their own choices here and be careful. But people need to see what is going on in there, because the way they got away with this for so long is nobody could see. It's underwater. They don't see the disease. They don't see the lice. They don't see the sick fish around the farm, and they don't see the sick fish in the farm. And then the other thing that worked was the endurance that it took to simply stand in the way of this industry. And if you could do that now, you might get a change that would allow for the jobs, would allow for aquaculture. I mean, there is land-based, and I understand there's some land-based being attempted in Maine that's going to pour all the waste into the ocean. Okay, well, that's nothing better. But there's also land-based that has really worked on recirculating everything. So they add oxygen, they collect all the waste, which is an incredibly rich fertilizing product, and it's completely contained. That is the technology that might work here. And so I'm just saying, if you can stop the dirty old 40-year-old technology that uses the ocean, externalizes all the costs, you might have a chance at starting something that would really work for your community and for your coast and for your future.
That's great. Thank you. We have a question here from a listener. I see farm salmon from Vietnam all the time in grocery stores. What's happening in Vietnam?
I don't know. Yeah, no, it might be they're just getting fish processed there. I see somebody saying, can you cite the contained land-based operations that are economically viable? You're just going to have to look that up yourself, but it's a new industry. Norway is pioneering it because they're worried about the industry. as far as I can see, Norway has given up on their wild salmon, but they want to save the salmon farming industry. So they're trying to get them out of the ocean where there's warming and algae blooms and spreading disease and escapes. They're trying to protect them by getting them into closed containment. And there's a, the Intrafish, which is the big fish farm publication, says that land-based aquaculture is the hottest trend in aquaculture. Whenever anybody starts one, it's overinvested in. They do have startup problems, but so did the net pen industry. So they either need to do that or just forget it. Just grow algae.
Yeah. So in the chat, Alex, we have a number of people that are asking sort of specifics about what can they do to prevent this in Frenchman Bay. And I wanted to just invite Crystal Canny to maybe, reflect on that, comment on that, and also you as well. If you've touched on several potential things that we should be thinking about, but I'm going to let Crystal give some specifics here on ways that folks on today's call can help.
Well, thanks, Jerry. From the Protect Maine's Fishing Heritage Foundation perspective, you need to engage with your legislators. And I put a couple of email addresses up there. You need to engage with your local legislators. You need to get letters into the governor's office. Protect Maine had a meeting with the governor almost 6 months ago, and there was a lot she didn't know. I think she's a little more in tune now, but she needs to hear that the people don't want the the Frenchman Bay project. And I will say that aquaculture is out the door. The rules and regulations in this state have really set the table for attracting exactly this kind of project. You can lease up to 1,000 acres. You can hold those leases for 20 years. You can transfer those leases without any public transparency. It is the sole discretion of the commissioner of DMR. And it's inexpensive. We are a cheap date for large scale industrial aquaculture. It's $100 an acre for a lease. Where on land could you ever lease an acre of land for $100 a year? And for the most part, these are exclusive use because lobstermen do not want to get tangled up in the gear. They don't want to be near the net pens. I heard somebody talk about at one point, I think it was you, Alex, some of the lobsters and how they looked. 2 years ago, lobstermen sworn under oath during a rulemaking petition testified they were finding dead lobsters in Jonesport. So Cook Aquaculture is currently the largest holder of leases with over 600 acres in Maine. And the lobstermen will, again, testified under oath that they were finding dead lobsters near the pens. So I think, we are partially there by lack of involvement. And I just have to applaud Frenchman's Bay United for helping to carry this extraordinarily heavy load.
Crystal, can you just comment on, Alex has mentioned a couple of times about occupying the farms and what an impact that had, but yet in Maine, there are rules preventing that. Is that correct?
Oh, it's absolutely correct. You can't get within 35 meters of a net pen. I liked what Alex said in terms of getting a camera to see what the fish look like. And I've seen some of that video. It's an ugly scenario. They are deformed fish. And I'm not saying that's what you would find at Cook, but how are we ever going to know? Because you can't get within 35 meters. There used to be a dive program in Maine where the state would dive underneath the net pens so they could look at the bottom and see what kind of impact there was. They did away with the dive program. Every rule and regulation that has come along since about 2006 has been to the benefit of large-scale industrial aquaculture. And just like Alex, there's a good place for small, well-sited aquaculture in Maine. It's important. Owner-operator model works very well where you're actually a steward of the ocean. But when you start raising these leases, whether it's shellfish or finfish to up into the hundreds of acres, you have a density and scale problem. And this horse really has gone out the door. So I feel like we have to work doubly hard at this point to pull some of that back.
Yeah,
those are all really good solutions. And no, it's against the law to occupy the farms here too. The trouble is, I just wish we had stopped it before it happened. When I arrived in the Broughton, there'd been 100 years of abuse of the streams, and there was still incredible abundance of salmon and whales and communities, and everybody had enough salmon for the winter. And the damage that has been done, that I don't know that we're going to be able to repair it, because we have climate change bearing down on us, and the genetic diversity that was there in salmon that would have allowed them to deal with what is happening now, that's been stripped away. It's been so catastrophic. And so maybe what you need to do also is push to be able to see inside these facilities. It's unacceptable. I don't know about in the US, but in Canada, the ocean is public water. In fact, we don't know who owns these farm salmon here in Canada, because I did a lawsuit in 2009, and the court said you can't own a salmon in the water. And so as soon as they get poured into the pen, even though there is a pen, it is the same water inside and outside the pen. And the judge said, you don't own these fish. The fish farm company wanted to appeal that part of the decision, but they weren't allowed. So we don't know who owns those fish. So if they're going to raise fish in the ocean and externalize all the costs in this day and age, for goodness sakes, when our oceans are just gasping, how can government just allow this to happen in another beautiful part of this world? So you need to get creative and push to be able to see inside, and push to get answers. How are they going to deal with all of these things? I mean, the infectious salmon anemia outbreaks. Infectious salmon anemia is in the influenza family. Influenza in farm animals is dangerous. I realize it's a fish, and I realize it's slightly different than human influenza. But how are they going to stop that? How are they going to stop the escapes? How are they going to stop all the things that have happened with this industry everywhere? There has to be real answers. Don't just call me an activist and discredit me and all of the other people who have done work on this industry. There needs to be like, okay, this is what we are going to do.
Mm-hmm.
They can't do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Jamie, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you. Alexandra, first of all, thank you for everything you've done. Just one question, I'm trying to sort through all the great information you've given. Do you have a view on whether the court stuff that you've done what was the most helpful, or trying to raise consciousness with politicians? Or am I right in thinking that you're saying what really got things going or made the biggest difference is activism in terms of public perception and sort of the media grabbing a hold of things and changing the environment for politicians? Is it that you're getting at, the importance of activism?
We have a tool here that I'm not sure you have, and that is that our First Nation governments are recognized by the courts as federal governments. So as soon as they intervened between the provincial federal situation and the fish, that's when things started to change. The problem with the lawsuits, for example, it's against the law in Canada to put farm salmon infected with a disease agent into the pen, into the pen in the oceans. And DFO scientists were actually arguing that this virus, Piscine orthoreovirus, was local and benign. Well, that was some DFO scientists, but other DFO scientists were saying the opposite. And certainly scientists in the other parts of the world were saying the opposite. And so even though the lawsuits, the legal mechanism I kept using were judicial reviews, which simply said the government had to make the decision again. The more effective might be a class action suit, but they're extremely expensive. And frankly, we didn't have the science behind us. But the reason I'm suggesting the salmon farming industry should consider running for the hills now is because we do have the science. And when you start to track a specific virus from specific hatcheries into specific runs of salmon with specific losses to people, well, then you start to have the basis of a class action suit.
That's very helpful.
The thing is, I just want to save the salmon. I really don't
Right.
care what the salmon farming industry does. I'm not really out to get them. They just need to get out of the way and let us save these last few fish. And I just want to say, we had an amazing minister of fisheries, and she prohibited 19 salmon farms on the Fraser-Sockeye migration route from restocking last spring. And I went down there and studied those fish this spring, and they were so beautiful. I mean, I've looked at thousands and thousands of juvenile salmon, and I didn't realize how plump they are. I thought they had curved backs, straight sides, and a round belly, but oh no, they're so rounded, they had little shadows under their bellies. And these were fish that had no sea lice, no bacterial infections, and no virus infections from the farms. And I can't wait for them to come home and see how many there are.
That's great.
Is she no longer employed?
No, she got voted out. We have another fisheries minister who may be good as well. We'll see.
Interesting. One of the other questions, Alex, that just popped in, are there also detrimental environmental effects from shellfish aquaculture farms?
You know, I've done very little on that, but I hear from people that are dealing with it. And the answer to that is yes, because anything that gets too big in the natural environment is a problem. So there's been cases where the shellfish farm has taken over an entire beach. They've covered the whole beach with netting. There's definitely problems with it. It's lesser though. Everything has to be done in moderation. The problem with the companies we have here is they're too big. They're an economy of scale. And so everything has to be huge. You have to have 1 million Atlantics in every farm, or, you know, close to that. You have to have a whole bunch of farms in one area, because if you're going to send a 300-foot wellboat in there, you know, it's got to be able to do a bunch of farms. It's just too big for the ocean to deal with. Problem.
So one other question in the chat, and I think, you know, you talked about this a little bit, about the failed trial of these semi-closed pens that you all experienced in British Columbia. I know you don't know all the details, but can you just recap that quickly for everyone so that they're aware that this is very similar technology to what is being proposed here in Frenchman Bay?
Yeah, so the organization that really knows about this is called Friends of Clayoquot Sound. That's CLAYQUOT, and they've done a lot of work on this. But as I understand it, the bottom is open. so all the waste drops through. And I think that the theory was that because sea lice are in the top level of the ocean, that it should stop the sea lice from getting in. But I don't know whether those fish were suffocating in there or what happened. But this is unproven technology. It's technology that actually has been proven not to work, just from this one example. Now, as I have said, you know, that you know, land-based is also new technology, and it is unproven. Agreed. These are both unproven technologies. But given how fragile our oceans are and how fragile our relationship with our planet, which we're hoping is going to keep sustaining us, but the evidence that it's not is mounting. Given all of that, every step we make right now has to be on the side of caution, the precautionary principle. And so in the case of this semi-closed containment farm, it didn't work for the farmer. So I don't know what happened with the wild fish around it, but it didn't work for the farmer, and they took it out. And they're not using it anymore. They're back to the net pens.
Interesting.
So wouldn't trust your bay with that.
Right. So, you know, sort of given what you know about American aquafarms and their proposal, and sort of where we are as a state in terms of aquaculture, can you just give us, excuse me, your thoughts about why have they targeted Maine, and particularly in an area with a national park that is so beloved by so many? Do you have any thoughts about? I mean, it doesn't seem very strategic.
Well, they are used to getting what they want. And so probably somebody's looking at a map somewhere back in Norway, and they did that for the Browden too. And they're like, oh, okay, this is going to have cool water. It's going to have enough protection. Oh, look, those communities are really small. Yeah, you don't need to really deal with those. Let's put it there. I mean, I think about it at some point in the early 90s, in some CEO's office, a circle was put around my home, the waters where I live, and they targeted it. And that's what's happened to you. You have cold, clean water. You have roads to get the product to market. You probably have electricity for them to use, places for their staff to stay. Oh, and a national park, which means more clean area for them to use. The water from that, they're going to be able to use.
Mhm.
And so you are a target for this activity.
Yeah. Any final questions for Alex before we express our appreciation to her for all she's done? All right. Alex, I can't thank you enough, not only for just the tremendous effort that you have put into this, but for being here, for continuing to be such an advocate on this issue, and for helping groups like ours, think about how we can be more proactive in protecting these waters that we all hold dear. So with us this evening, and we hope that you'll come back and kind of monitor our progress and hold our feet to the fire. So we really, really appreciate your time.
I'm here for you. I'm on Facebook. You can ask me a question. Whoever's named doctor in your chat, I'd love to know who they are. But anyway, they're clearly industry. And to that person, I would just say the way forward is to admit to your problems and do something about it. Because, the light's on in the room. Everybody can see it now. And to go in and dupe a community that doesn't know as much about it, it's just wrong. And so my heart goes out to all of you. I hope you're able to save your beautiful part of this world. And I'm here to help as much as possible.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And for those of you who have yet not had a chance to read Alex's book, I would really encourage you to do so, because it's such a motivational factor in terms of really helping all of us understand exactly what's at stake here. And so I would encourage you to check out a copy. It's terrific. And thanks to all of you for being here this evening, for giving us the gift of your time, and for educating yourself about this issue. This is our final 2021, but we will be back in January with another series of events. So we hope all of you will continue to stay in touch, stay connected, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you. If you enjoyed what you heard tonight, you'd like to support this effort, you can find out more information at mdibl.org. And if you go to events, you can learn more about our science cafes and how to support them. So thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you back here in January. And thanks to our speaker, Alex, for such a great presentation this evening.